Hello, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Daily Energy Markets podcast, special edition today for all the obvious reasons. Brent crude oil is trading at the moment 7%, up about $5 on the day. But ultimately, I suppose, from a very narrow prism of oil markets, it has come off. Oil prices that peaked, at least in the early hours of this morning, trade at $78.31, have now come back after the initial news was published, and we have come off to reflect something a bit more, you would say, moderate, given the news. Let's start off this morning we're delighted, obviously, to have voices from all over the world today, and some of our top podcast commentators from India, from the US, from London, and from here in Dubai. But I'm going to start this morning with Aman Nasri, Managing Director, Middle East at FG Nexant. Aman obviously is, like myself, geographically closest to this story, and also is obviously also Iranian, and so has a personal sense of awareness to that all. So, Aman, your thoughts? I mean, where to start? What's the first question? I suppose I'll start with the crass one, and that is: have we seen the sort of the high point from the impact for oil markets when we saw prices spike at first on the news and the uncertainty, and now come off? Your thoughts on that question, and the overarching outlook for this, what seems now like probably the first you could define as a potential of a war, a new war in the region.
Yeah. I think we saw the peak of prices in reaction to the news and the headlines and what has happened so far. I don't think we have seen the peak of prices in reaction to what is going to unfold or what's coming next. So far, obviously, this was just geopolitical. This was the fear factor that pushed the prices. There is no interruption. There is no disruption in supply. So this was just a reaction, a premium of maybe now another risk premium, which these days is not as long-lived as it used to be. So even this $5, how long would that last, is a questionable. But
It's the case that the administration has had clear warnings that this was coming. And I think, Trump's statement, the administration's statement this week, the the phone call between Trump and Netanyahu on Monday, was all a clear sign that the US was worried about that something serious was coming down the pike. But I think, this is one of those times where the Americans said no, and they were tested by Netanyahu, and where the Israelis went ahead and did what they wanted to do anyway. The Americans seemingly seem to think that, or at least the Trump administration seemed to think that, by stating that they were still open for talks and that they had nothing to do with it, that somehow sort of Iran was going to look at the situation and believe that it was entirely unilateral. I think over time that will be tested. Where I think this sort of has a longer lead is in two ways. One is, what does it say about the credibility of US diplomacy and the credibility of the US as a negotiating partner when in the midst of talks that the administration has held up, and in the midst of talks where the administration is clearly was signaling that they might be close to a deal, that America's closest ally in the region has just blown that up, literally and metaphorically. So I think, in terms of the credibility of US as a negotiating partner, this is another nail in the coffin on top of what we've seen with the Trump administration so far. But there's also a question of how the US manages this moving forwards. On the one hand, you have a very, very shallow bench when it comes to Middle East policy making. There are no heavy hitters, which sort of sends this back fundamentally to Trump, to Witkoff, and to a small set of individuals who thus far sort of appear to, be struggling to manage a crisis and to contain a crisis. And this is going to be a test of Trump, I think, within the Republican Party. A number of Republican sort of Congress men have come out ahead of Trump. I've had statements of clear support for Israel and clear support for the notion that somehow this was defensive and preemptive. And Lindsey Graham's statement, I think, on X when the news first broke of "Game on, pray for Israel" gives you a sense of the mood there. So I think as we move forwards there, there's also going to be a domestic aspect to this. And the final question of if there is a large-scale Iranian retaliation, which sort of appears to be on the cards, does the US then become actively involved? That's how it became actively involved last time. And in this occasion, is the US going to stand aside and let Israel be attacked? Or is the US going to get involved? And if it does, then you've got a three-way war in the region, not just a two-way one.
Let's go to India. Narendra Taneja, India's leading energy expert. Narendra, we're seeing now as the hours evolve the reaction, and in this neighborhood where I am, Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, and Qatar, the four main of the GCC states, condemning Israel for its preemptive strike on Iran. Where will India stand on this? Where do you think how this event will be perceived? And obviously, we know the American position is articulated there by Rad, somewhat complicated, somewhat compromised in their ability. But where does India, do you think, going to stand on something like this?
Well, I mean, India has a huge stake in that region. We've got 10 million Indians working there. Our economies are quite integrated. And at the same time, for many of the things that we are trying to do in terms of India, Middle East economic corridor, et cetera, I mean, we look at Europe via the Middle East. That has been the past, ancient past, and that's kind of, a premise that on which India is building the future. So therefore, a huge stake, But that said, at the same time, our second worry is that, if you really decode what is happening and what might happen, look at the country which is going to be the main beneficiary is going to be China, and that's not a very happy kind of,
In what way? In what sense?
Well, if you, for instance, if the United States get bogged down, I mean, first of all, get involved and then get bogged down in the Middle East. And that means that it will not really have enough diplomatic and military bandwidth to, for instance, see what happened in South China Sea and in Taiwan. If the United States get bogged down first in Ukraine and Europe and now in the Middle East and all that, then, that will be a kind of open invitation to China to move into Taiwan. So that's one. Number two is that, in the entire region, with the United States growing weaker and weaker, literally by week, that means which other country has kind of military, diplomatic, and economic capacity to really try to move into it. Not that the China, the United States, but at the same time, its presence will grow. We have already seen that in Iran, for instance. So therefore, the question is that, what Israel is trying to do, the way we are looking at it from New Delhi. I mean, if you see the last 18 hours, what Israel has been targeting is very simple. They're trying to decapitate A, the nuclear leadership of Iran, and B, the military leadership. Look at the targets. It's very clear. And in the process, they want to engineer a kind of regime change in Iran. Can they really achieve it? Is kind of Israel alone capable of achieving and all that? Is the United States somewhere behind the picture? We don't know that. We don't have any evidence. But at the same time, if you look at, study that, so-called preemptive or whatever you call it, attacks, it's very clear that Israel alone probably can't do it, because these are very, very, if you look at the quality of attacks, very precise, even an apartment going exactly to the 6th floor, not to the 7th floor.
And on the back of all that, should we expect that India will join the GCC states in condemning this attack, or will India remain silent?
Well, you see, the question is that, as far as India is concerned, the GCC is very, very close and a strategic friend. and so is Israel, and so is the United States. So we hope that, these countries look at Iran is an ancient civilization, Arab countries are ancient civilizations, and we all know the US. We hope that they don't need any kind of, thing from us. All we want is then them to come to the negotiating table. We want Iran to come to the negotiating table, not only with the United States, but also with the International Atomic Energy Agency. But let's not forget one thing. In the entire region, the only country that has nuclear weapon is Israel. No other country in the region has nuclear weapons. Of course, there are nuclear weapons in Turkey, but those weapons don't belong to Turkey. They belong to NATO. But except for Israel, no other country has nuclear weapons. But if Iran acquires nuclear weapon capability, within no time, you will have Egypt, you will have Turkey, you will have Saudi Arabia, you will have even United Arab Emirates, all actually rushing to acquire nuclear weapon capability. And that will change the geopolitical equilibrium, not only in the Middle East, across North Africa and Central Asia. We don't want to see that. In India, we don't want all these countries acquiring nuclear weapon capability. So that's actually the biggest challenge. At the same time, we want to see economic equilibrium. We want economic stability because that's good for us. And we also think that, it's important post the United States that these countries should be able to manage their own affairs in such a way that they can keep other powers, especially China, out of it.
Mark Oswald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International. Mark, going back to where we started, the oil price reacted quite, as one would expect, with a big spike. It has come off. The uncertainty still remains. However, the supply issue, the increases that we saw in recent months by OPEC Plus, the market seemed to be less concerned here that demand isn't robust enough and the supply is plentiful. So this would need to go dramatically off course in order for it to really impact the oil flows. Your thoughts on the supply-demand context here?
Yes, I mean, I think everyone still feels that the supply context for the oil markets is more than plentiful, not only just down to the OPEC increases in production, but also from the perspective that demand, which is not going to be helped by this, is going to is basically not going to improve much. Whether it's from China or whether it's from the rest of the world. Whether thanks to, above all, to the trade tensions that there are. So I think that serves to temper, or rather prompt these sort of moves where you get the spike and then people say, yes, but what about demand and what about the supply outlook? Nevertheless, you can still see a situation, as I think everyone's pointed out, that this looks like a protracted conflict. And therefore, everything is focused on the upside, even if the overall supply-demand balance in oil's context is still seen as something which will keep those gains not under control, but certainly will serve to temper those gains.
Iman, just speaking, kicking up on the earlier comments there, the oil infrastructure exposure in a conflict like this, we've seen the region tragically, and particularly the Levant area, obviously the tragic Gaza events in Lebanon and Syria and so forth in recent years, but never energy infrastructure. And even last year when Iran and Israel faced off, the energy infrastructure, bar nuclear energy, of course, was off the cards. And even last year, nuclear was not targeted. Mm-hmm. But on this occasion, the energy infrastructure, the nuclear is targeted. But from the point of view of oil and gas, are these geographically very far removed from each other? So even very unlikely that an accident would happen? Your thoughts of where that would need to go in order to bring oil and gas infrastructure into this equation? You mentioned earlier that would probably have to be introduced by Iran rather than being introduced by the Israeli-US axis. Your thoughts on this, where those two things cross over?
A few comments come to mind as I listen to your question. First, maybe I start with the fact that there has been no attack on nuclear energy. So remember, the nuclear sites that they have been targeted is basically those that enrich uranium. It has nothing to do with nuclear energy peaceful use, at least in the case of Iran. Iran has one power plant that is Russian built and Russian fueled. So anything that is consumed as fuel in the 1 gigawatt nuclear power plant in Iran is not domestic produced and has nothing to do with Iran's peaceful or not nuclear program. Nuclear program is the ability to produce fuel in case they wanted to expand their power plants in future or just have the knowledge. So far, even if all of the nuclear sites in Iran gets destroyed, it has nothing to do with energy infrastructure. It's a scientific site, right? Number two, there have been some headlines that Tabriz refinery or Abadan refinery have been hit, immediately rejected by the NIOC, and I don't think even the Israelis have made it clear that intentional damage to oil facilities, being the refineries or power plants or the upstream facilities, oil and gas, is not on the cards. And whether an accident can happen, I don't think so, unless it's a huge accident, because no, proximity is not in a way that you hit here and that then they are well distanced and they are well designed to be safe from each other, or oil facilities from anything like that. Whether a full-blown war will put these things at risk, yes, but again, that's a few steps further down the road. So I think we should not expect an interruption in the oil supply or energy market in terms of fundamentals, unless we see things getting out of whack and basically turn into a regional war. And again, if Israel goes into what they have said they wouldn't, which is destroying infrastructure, be it energy infrastructure or anything non-military, non-nuclear, I think that could trigger an Iran retaliation on energy infrastructure.
Rad, the regional reaction I mentioned earlier, we've had some condemnations from the GCC states. Paint to us a picture of how does this, what are the ripples of this across the region in the current context of the scale of what we're seeing, the possible fractures that could appear, do you think?
I think it's early days. I mean, I think the first thing that the region is going to want to do is batten down the hatches. I mean, this is a conflict that it didn't want. It signaled very clearly that it didn't want. It's obviously sort of a number of the key states, the UAE and Saudi Arabia, have improved relations with Tehran measurably over the past year or so, and now find themselves, prey to the consequences of a conflict that they've not been involved in, and have probably sort of not been that well informed about the imminency of. So it really goes back to what the Israelis intend to achieve and on what scale, and what the Iranian response is. And Narendra mentioned sort of decapitation, and I think that becomes the sort of key thing to focus on, is that this isn't just about nuclear facilities. This is about the Iranian military capacity writ large and its chain of command writ large. It's something more akin to what the Israelis did with Hezbollah, than surgical strikes that are that are aimed specifically at the nuclear program. And if it does go on over weeks, certainly if it goes on over days, then the region is going to become more and more concerned. I think
do we have any lessons that we can learn or extract from the Hezbollah? You mentioned the experience in Lebanon last year, where Israel seemed to have a unilateral ability to implement serious consequences for the destruction of Hezbollah, and obviously Gaza is just a bunch of people. Israel can enforce its writ on something as great and as large as Iran in the way
I
they've
think we're
done?
about to. I think we're about to find the answer to that out in the next sort of 72 hours, because there is a notion that this is going to be a regional war, that it's a war somehow of the two most powerful militaries in the region. Israel has material superiority, and the United States has ensured that Israel has had material superiority to any army in the region. And I think where it starts to become uncertain is if the Iranians do try to respond and their response is parried, at what point that then gives the Israelis the confidence to launch this on a larger and more extended scale. And that's the lesson from Hezbollah. The fear always was that if Israel attacked Hezbollah, Hezbollah had its missile cache that could rain down terror on Israel. That didn't happen, and it allowed, as you said, the Israelis to act at will. If that same pattern materializes to a certain extent with Iran, if the response is blunted, or the Israelis prove that Iron Dome and sort of various other measures that they have can minimize the damage and risk to Israel, then I think now that this has started, you've opened the door as the Netanyahu government to taking more escalatory action. And then you get into the realm of regime change, or at least trying to nudge regime change in some fashion. And through the region, there's going to be debate about the virtues of that. There are going to be a number of leaderships in the region that are going to see that as a positive strategic outcome, and one that enhances their own power. And so it's the second and third order consequences of this. But for the most part, I think over the next few weeks, what the region is going to want to do is hope that the conflict can be minimized and ultimately, can be stopped, and then they'll pick up the pieces thereafter.
Narendra, on that point, the stopping, the intervening, this is now the number one and only item on the G7 agenda in Canada, and the G everybody who's attending agenda, including your own Prime Minister, I would expect. Is there a point in which the powers that be, including India, which you sort of indicated in your earlier comment, weren't even willing on this occasion to condemn Israel and haven't been willing to do so in their activities in the last 2 or 3 years, that this Netanyahu government, this rogue nation now it has upturned the international order of human rights, the global commitment to the Security Council. Everything has basically been thrown up in the air. Is there a point at which India joins a conversation that says this rogue nation that is on charges in the International Criminal Court for war crimes and genocide perhaps needs to be curtailed? Could that be a conversation item in Canada for the G7? Your thoughts on that and India's position on that idea?
You see, the point is the kind of world we live in today, the kind of order, disorder that we have in the world today. Each country is basically trying to protect its own national interests. So our Prime Minister travels to Canada not to preach this or that, is going to basically see to protect our national interests, because the way we look at the world is very different. For instance, the way you look at the world in Washington, D.C. or Paris or Dublin for that matter. You see, so our focus is going to be basically look at G7, the construct of G7. These are mainly the countries which are kind of may say whatever in public, but the fact remains that many of them are on the side of Israel, and they are very close to the United States. And at the same time, as I said, we have to see and really what Israel has targeted the last 18 hours. Is the target basically is Iran's capacity to retaliate? Have they really succeeded in that? I'm talking of, ballistic missiles, talking of the military establishments, and also the nuclear establishment, and so on and so forth. So these are the questions. The question is that, in the Middle East, particularly, what countries like us, we want is basically that there should be stability. Don't forget that Iran is a member of BRICS, and India is a very strong member, one of the founders of BRICS. So we look upon Iran for 2 ways. One, a civilization friend. Don't forget that both Iran and India are Aryan civilization. Both the countries are Aryan. So we have very close relations with Iran, people to people. At the same time, of course, if Iran wants to acquire nuclear weapon capability, and if it's not acceptable to Iran's neighbors, and others' neighbors start shopping nuclear weapons in Pakistan or in North Korea, is that a kind of situation? We don't want that. Now, so that's the thing. But so when it comes to the G7, the focus is going to be, a lot of focus is going to be, number one, on the Middle East, and number two is going to be economy and energy in particular. You see, so this is, and for us, you can imagine, we are the third largest, energy consumer in the world. We are the fourth largest economy, and we are actually, the country is still heavily dependent on imports. We import roughly 89% of total requirement of oil. So if Strait of Hormuz tomorrow, for instance, something happens there, or for instance, Iran decide, all right, if nothing else, let's do something so that, 20% of the global oil trade is adversely affected. The country that's going to be hit the hardest would be India. So we will definitely, if this comes up in G7, India is going to take it up and say, look, let's not create that kind of situation. But the main question is that, today the main point is we still don't know the depth of damage that Iran has suffered. Number two, we still don't know whether Iran, A, wants to retaliate or is in a position to retaliate. Had its infrastructure, military infrastructure, had been severely damaged, we don't know that. The only thing we want is that, when it comes to International Atomic Energy Agency, the last governing body meeting of International Energy Agency, they have kind of asked many tough questions to Iran. So we're not talking Israel, we're not talking the United States, but when an organization like International Atomic Energy Agency raises questions, we have to listen to them. Countries like India, we have to listen to them. And though they have raised some very serious questions.
Mark, looking at sort of pulling back the lens here on the wider macro impact of an event of this scale, and it's still the early hours, but if one sort of extrapolates the scale of what we're seeing, and even on its own, we're seeing essentially in a very generic way, stocks down, oil and gold up. Your thoughts on what the macro dominoes could be here, a time in which the US economy is starting to feel like it's being challenged a little bit by already tariffs, the tariff policies of the US government, etc. How do you see the macro impact of an event of this scale as it unfolds?
Well, I think the first point to make is that the benign inflation data that we've seen, particularly across Europe, is basically shot now, because a lot of that was basically predicated on the fall in oil prices that we've seen this year, above all in reaction to the OPEC production increase. That's going to be challenging for a lot of central banks. It's going to make them much more conscious of the energy price. Even though there's nothing that central banks can do about energy prices, they know what the feed through is, particularly in terms of COVID. In terms of the global growth outlook, well, we haven't really talked much about the Chinese reaction to all of this. China was the broker of the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it can't be looking at this very happily. Its partner, or perceived partner, Russia, probably is thinking.
And Narendra said that China would be the big winner. That would be India's perspective.
I said beneficiary, not
beneficiary.
Winner.
Sorry.
Beneficiary, yes. There's a difference. In diplomatic terms, it's not great for China. So it just creates a much more challenging environment in terms of the growth prospects, on top of all the trade tensions. And then one has to ask, what does the US regime, looking at all of this, as much as we've had people like Mike Johnson basically tacitly approving, and a number of others tacitly approving what Israel's done, what does it mean for the whole trade and other negotiations that are going on in that context? So it's another dampener on global growth prospects. But more importantly, I think, are the inflation risks that it implies, particularly in a more protracted conflict. It's not good news for anybody.
It's not good news for anybody. Let's go to the survey question before we do a last round of comments, going a little longer today for obvious reasons. Have we already seen the peak spike in oil markets reaction to Israel attack on Iran? We're already, even since the half hour we've been talking, prices have even dropped further down now to 6% or so, from 12 or 13% spike at the early hours to half of that. Could we end up the day even with no change in oil price? But ultimately, the question for the survey is, have we already seen the peak spike reaction? We've always wondered what it would be on the day that Israel and Iran went to war, and we've had many times that being quoted, 100 plus and da-da-da, and now we're kind of not seeing that. But Rad, I wanted to get some insights from you, do you think, on how this plays out in the US? Because in some ways this, don't look at us, we're nothing to do with it, kind of makes the American president, the most powerful man in the world, sitting on the biggest military force in the world, somewhat impotent and a lackey to the Israeli rogue prime minister. I mean, how is this, do you think, from a geopolitical sort of optics of the US going into the G7, where he wanted to come in as being big Donald Trump and he's been pushed around by Netanyahu? How do you see that narrative, the idea of, I couldn't stop him, plays as for the most powerful man in the world?
I think it depends on sort of what you think the most powerful man in the world is trying to project. I think on the one hand, there's going to be frustration within the administration. As I say, he went out of his way to state that that the Americans didn't want to see this happen, and he cautioned Netanyahu. And if nothing else, his chances of a Nobel Peace Prize have just taken another bashing, which I think from a personal perspective will bother him. I think what Trump will pivot as Trump always pivots. And the interesting thing about this reaction is the fact that the US emphasized its unilateralism once again. I mean, we're in a situation where you have a major conflict in the Middle East, and the US president hasn't said anything. And has scheduled an NSC meeting for 11 o'clock DC time today, and is, everyone's falling back on the Rubio statement, which was tepid support for Israel at best, and essentially, again, focused on the US and US interests. So I wonder whether, the US going into the G7 is going to be sort of is going to sort of be captivated by this issue and have it front and center. Or whether, you very quickly see the US pivot back, particularly given news cycles. If this continues for a week or two, the reality is the news cycle will get bored of it unless there's another major escalation. And the US goes in, again, focusing on trade, and emphasizing that, probably
handcuffing the US senator
had a chance and didn't take it. But privately, as I say, I think it undermines the credibility of the US as a negotiating partner, and really highlights that how unilateralism can get out of hand in the world, and leave opportunities for other states to act with what they believe is impunity. And that's part of what Netanyahu gambled on, that Trump is a unilateralist.
Power wins. Iman, the same question to you from what you perceive the Iranian reaction here. I've always sort of operate from the premise that the most important thing to Tehran is the preservation of the regime in Tehran, and every decision is based on that outcome. Your thoughts on that being the primary prism today? And if it is, then what are the likely decisions? You would think non-escalation, but your thoughts on that as a realistic prism, and I'm completely wrong, or is this an occasion where national kind of identity is at stake?
No, you are right. That is the first and foremost goal in any decisions they've made. Any reaction, even to the other non-Iran events, such as the Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis. Many people expected perhaps more kind of pronounced reaction to some of the events that we've seen in Levant area, but it didn't, because ultimately it wasn't in line with the primary objective of preserving the regime. Now, right now, as I mentioned in my earlier comments, at this stage, if it's I see if Israel's operation is done, to whatever we have seen, which is not insignificant, I think the reaction could stay at drones and some ballistic missiles. But if it continues for at least another day, if not longer, then I think the reaction and retaliation is going to be larger and continued on the Iranian side as well. As I also mentioned, I don't think they would jump to energy infrastructure. I think they will also threaten or try to target some of the US bases, as Foreign Minister of Iran already mentioned that they blame US as the main responsible party, despite their direct involvement or not. They said they held them accountable. And they also mentioned on the state TV this morning, by the way, that they are not going to go to Oman for 6 rounds of negotiations. It's off with they don't negotiate. So I think we have to wait and watch what's coming the next. As Rod said, 72 hours or 24 hours is very important how things unfold, especially on the Israeli side. If this is it, I think Iran will go for containing and not escalation. But if things continue, then I would expect a degree of escalation to come from Iranian side as well.
Narendra, I wanted to get a sort of a bigger picture sense from you. Obviously, you mentioned earlier that China could be a beneficiary here, as you articulate quite often, and again today, that G7 is a sort of an early redundant structure, and the world is changing, and we are in a change moment. And it's a transition era. We've seen the West collectively reference the West and struggle with war in Europe, have been unable to contain or have not been willing to contain the war, the attack on Gaza, and now the West, major supporting country in the region, is engaging in another war in Iran. I mean, the whole point there from the Asia, from the BRICS, from the global South, how will they be looking at that collection? Is it an accelerator when you put it all together to this change, the greater flow and turn to other centers of gravity in the world, like a China, like in India?
Well, the way we are looking at it is varying. I mean, we think that America in particular and the West part of the world, they don't understand Iran. They don't understand Islam. They don't understand the Arab world. But at the same time, they insist that they do. Even Chinese really, do they understand Islam? Do they understand the Arab world? Do they understand Iran at all? No, according to us, they don't. And that's part of the reason. When I say China will benefit, because China has invested heavily already in Iran, they want to invest $460 billion as part of their BRI initiative and so on and so forth. Now, the question is that when we in India, we think that we also don't want Iran to acquire nuclear weapons, but we want Iran to be mainstreamed. Iran to be, mainstream in terms of politics, in terms of global economic order, everything. For instance, we would love to buy oil from Iran, more oil from Iran. We would like to invest there, but we are not allowed because there are sanctions. They create problems for our companies and players and so on and so forth. Now, the question is that unless and until you mainstream Iran, you will not have the kind of political or geopolitical stability that the world needs. Now, but at the same time, the reality is Israel has its own way of looking at the world. Iran also has its own way of looking at particularly the Middle East and Central Asia and also the world. Iran is still live in the past. For them, it was a great civilization and a great power, but it's no longer a great power. There are many other countries in the world, they think they live in the past, for instance, China. Now, those are the challenges. Now, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the 30 years the world enjoyed that stability because there was only one superpower, and that was the United States. But that's, for instance, fading. And we have not yet really, the world is not there in terms of the multipolar world. So I think what we have witnessed the last 18 hours, what we are witnessing in Gaza, what we are witnessing in other parts of the world, this is only the beginning. My own sense is the next 15, 20 years, we're going to see more of that. And one region which is going to see more such troubles and is going to take much longer time before actually fire starts, going down, coming down, that's the Middle East. And worry for countries like India is because we are still an oil economy. We are still heavily dependent on oil. And at the same time, we have millions working, in the Middle East. We are heavily integrated in terms of economy with the Middle Eastern countries. So we have a lot to lose and we have a lot to gain if things work out in a positive direction. My own sense is that, what Israel is trying to do, if the aim is to topple the government there, go for a regime change, what they are forgetting is, since they also don't understand Islam, they will only end up strengthening the second line of leadership in Iran, which is actually, in terms of whether they, are they hardliners? They are probably super hardliners. So what Israel is going to get in the process, super hardliners in power in Tehran.
Super hardliners. Mark, the last word to you. Bring us back to some sober macro space. Survey result says that we haven't seen. It's a much bigger number than I thought. But the sort of the macro ramifications here, perhaps oil prices are also falling because, as you indicated, this isn't good for anybody or anything, and economic growth suffers, and so demand on energy goes down, and hence a sober outlook. Your thoughts on the macro position and where any strength could come into the macro position, or is it all bearish?
Sadly, it's very difficult to look at this in any form of positive way, simply because, amidst all the uncertainty, to have upward pressure on oil prices, even if it's capped, because of the uncertainty and because of these, the production, no one needs that. Really, no one needs that at all. I think it's going to be interesting in terms of what countries are going to do, basically facing an increase in energy prices again after the loss. How they react to this, because that's really, in a lot of cases going to be actually quite key. Most countries were actually quite glad of the fall in oil prices because they could start removing a lot of the subsidies that they put in place. Are they going to have to put them back in place? Given the debt positions, and I think it's interesting or salutary in all of this. Yes, we've seen equity markets fall quite sharply, the oil price go up and down. Did bond markets get the safe haven bid? No, they did not. It's so modest. US Treasury yields are down by 2 to 3 basis points across the curve. That basically also means that this whole global debt.
But they did have a good bond sale yesterday. The 30-year bond sale, Treasuries seem to have a very big pickup.
Yeah, but we're still not really actually seeing much benefit to bond markets, and that is going to be definitely from in certain sense it's logical. If energy is going to put upward pressure on inflation, why would you be rushing into the long end? My concern would be the front end of the curve is not getting the trip. We've seen 2-year yields down 2 basis points. That's that's not even worth talking about.
Yeah.
So there is this debt problem, which this whole situation of increased tensions only exacerbates.
Well, if we keep talking, the oil price will keep falling, it seems. Our 45 minutes together has knocked a few percentage points and dollars off of the spike, which is now down to under $73 at 72.64, and it seems to be deflating all the time. Not that tells us much about the scale of the crisis in Iran, and more about where the oil market sees this story merge with the reality of basic supply and demand. Listen, we're going to wrap it up there. I have to thank our amazing panel for taking 45 minutes of their busy morning, late night, early day, whatever it might be, to give us their very valuable insights on this evolving story and situation. And as everybody has more or less said, a lot of more clarity will emerge in the next 24, 48 hours. Going into the weekend, of course, and a G7 weekend, I think, will we see from G7 more of the sort of muted response? As Rad said, the US government is not even scheduled a meeting until 11 a.m. Washington time, which seems that's another 10 or 11 hours away. And no urgency there. Is that the tone that the G7 will take? Nothing to see here, lads. Let's talk about the nice mountains in Canada. We'll see. Narendra Taneja, awesome. Wonderful to have you from India. Mark Otswald, thank you so much from London. Rad Al Qadiri from Washington, and Iman Nasri from the greatest city in the world, Dubai. No, that's just a small bias. Thank you guys. Have a great weekend, and hopefully this doesn't turn out to be the worst case scenario version. Thank you.
Inshallah.
Thank you.